October the 16th. This is John Wicklund interviewing Van Smith.
Good morning. My name is Van Smith. I was born September 8, 1928 in Oneida, New York, which is in the exact center of the state of New York, upstate. I lived in Oneida through high school, with the exception of 2 years in Connecticut, in the 7th and 8th grades. Oneida was a very Catholic community. It was a small town of 10,000 people, interrupted through the center by the New York-Chicago, New York Central Railway, 6 railways wide. And on the north side of our tracks in the town I grew up was the Italian parish of St. Joseph's. And on the south side of the tracks was the Irish parish of St. Patrick's. And I always characterized my little hometown as being 1/3 Irish, 1/3 Italian, and 1/3 other. And it was a typical community where my ancestors and my Irish family would probably rather see me date an other than they would to date an Italian from across the tracks. But wonderful, wonderful, predominantly Catholic community. And the 2 years in Connecticut were interesting. Again, a predominantly Catholic state. One of the, I think, 2 or 3 states that were more Catholic, more than 50% Catholic. And after high school in Oneida, I left those Catholic communities. I went to Colgate as an undergrad, graduated on the 19th day of June in 1950 with the prospect of selecting between 2 job offers, both of which were with banks in Philadelphia. But on the 25th day of June, while I was driving around with 3 or 4 fraternity brothers who joined me for 10 days after graduation to travel a bit, we were shocked when President Truman declared the Korean War as being started on 25th day of June, 1950. So we rushed back, and I enlisted in the Air Force, and served in the Air Force enlisted for 4 years as a private, and after 7 or 8 months got a direct commission to second lieutenant, and served in this country and over in England, and then got out of the service surprisingly a year early because the Korean War had ended, and I kept up to date on the administrative military regulations, and there was a newly proposed regulation that would allow people to get out 1 year early because they had more people than they wanted. So I immediately took advantage of that, applied to get out, and I got out of the service. It would have been in May of 1953. I thought, here I am, no plans, out a year early, what am I going to do? So I visited some of the law schools thinking this would be a great thing to do. I visited with Yale, I had correspondence with Northwestern, and all of those schools said, this is wonderful, why don't you apply? We have this year's class for September already selected, so you could apply for next year. And one of the things I did in that searching process, I visited Washington, D.C., and I stopped in the office of Georgetown Law School. Georgetown was downtown, not out at the college, the law school. And I happened to run in by chance to Father Lucy, who was the Jesuit who was the president of the law school in the lobby. And he stopped and said hello and talked to me and said, what are you doing? And I told him, looking around, and he said, you know what, Smith? He said, you'll find some girl and you'll find some job and you'll have a family and you'll never go to your law school a year from now. So he said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll let you in law school in September. And there was no LSAT, there was no anything. And thanks to the good graces of a great Catholic priest, Father Lucy, I entered law school in September. And being a veteran, you could go through law school in 2 years. So I attended both the day school and the night school, and went through law school in 2 years. And also in D.C., because you were a veteran, you could take the bar exam before you graduated. So in 23 months, I finished law school and was a member of the bar. And that was the education portion. That would have been in the summer of 1955. And on the 18th of September, 1955, I came to Muncie, Indiana. My father had died when I was 2 years old, and I was the first child, and my widowed mother went to work, and my widowed grandmother, her mother, quit her job where she was sewing linings in a casket factory in Oneida, New York, and my grandmother kept the house, and my mother worked, and the three of us lived. While I was at Colgate, my mother remarried, and she and her husband were living half-time in Muncie, Indiana, running the Ontario Silver Company for people in New York that owned it, and they were living half-time in Connecticut. So I came out to see them in Indiana, and my stepfather suggested I have lunch with a lawyer in Muncie, Indiana, named Ray Clark at the firm of Warner, Clark and Warner. And I went to lunch, had a very nice lunch with Ray Clark, and he had, before lunch, had shown me around the office that they had downtown in Muncie. And after lunch, we went back to the office, and he said, there's one room I didn't show you, and it was a room next to the library, which was vacant. And he said, you know, we enjoyed very much having lunch and meeting you this morning, and I would be happy to suggest to you that you might want to move in there. We'll put some furniture in there, and we'll pay you $25 a week to practice law here. And my excitement when I thought about that consequence was I'd be able to sort of reacquaint myself with my mother after service in college, and that I would get to know my stepfather a lot better than I already did. I had great respect for him. We knew him back in Oneida, New York, before he lost his wife. So I came out on the 18th of September and moved in with my stepfather and mother and started practicing law in Muncie, Indiana, with the thought that I would probably be here for a year, taking the advice of Ray Clark, who said, come practice in Muncie for a year, and then you'll go out to New York or Connecticut where you want to practice eventually, and you'll be a year ahead of all those people getting out of law school, and you can say, I've been to the county courthouse, I've tried a case, and I've got 1 year of experience. So I thought this is going to be a wonderful year to get reacquainted and get ready to go to New York or Connecticut. And I ran into a school teacher in Muncie, Indiana, named Margaret Kennedy, and never left Muncie, Indiana. I'm still here. By the good graces of my parole officer and the sheriff, I'm still here.
What were your impressions of the community when you first came?
Well, when I came to the community, it was, to me, coming from upstate New York and from Connecticut, this was mission country for a Catholic. The percentage of Catholics in the county, I can't testify to exactly, but as I recall, it was around 3%. And during the years I have lived here, the newer travel that takes place in population, the profile of people moving around, has brought a higher population of Catholics to Muncie and Delaware County. I don't know where we are today, but I suppose we're, I don't know, 10 or 11%, I would suppose, maybe 12. I don't know exactly, but it is substantially higher than it was. And the attitude of the community is far different today in Muncie, Indiana, than it was in 1955. I recall Bill Craig, who was one of the owners of WLBC at the time, radio station here in Muncie, was a Catholic from St. Lawrence Parish, and was one of the few Catholics who were active in civic affairs. And as a young lawyer, I became fairly active, was president of JC's, and that was a big organization at the time, 300 or 400 young men, all men. And Bill and I became active, and one night I said to Bill, Bill, I haven't really gotten to know you. I'd really like to know you as a Catholic active in the community. And Bill said, well, Smith, he said, we don't get to see each other because every organization wants a token Catholic on the board, and you're on half and I'm on the other half, so we never get to see you. And that was sort of the feeling we had. And I always said that the thing that impressed me that Muncie treated Catholics the way we treated non-Catholics up in Oneida, where I was born. It was an interesting. It never bothered me. I was proud of my heritage. I was proud to be a Catholic. Never felt put on by anyone. Never felt the need to evangelize, but felt the need to be present and have a Catholic presence in the community, and to be one of many people who represented that and try to do it well.
So you didn't feel any either overt or covert?
No, I never felt any overt or covert prejudices. Or, in fact, in 1960, as a Republican Catholic, and there were no such things, you know, where I came from in Oneida, I was a member of a Democrat family, and my grandmother that I mentioned was a Union person throughout, and her brother-in-law was mayor of the town, and he was a Union guy, and I was a Union Irish Catholic kid, and no doubt about it. And so it was different. I was interested in what was happening in the Republican Party, and I was not particularly pleased with the leadership that some union leaders were bringing. It wasn't an emotional thing, but it was an intellectual judgment that I joined the Republican Party and became active. Didn't agree with everything, but said I'll do what I can to change it. And in 1960, I was elected to the legislature as a young Catholic lawyer in Muncie. And I think I know the first Catholic Republican. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of the first Catholics ever elected to public office here in this very Protestant community at that point, at that time.
Do you think that's the biggest change now, that there are more Catholics involved? Or
well, I think that what has happened, people in this community, or in Oneida, or in New Haven, Connecticut, where I came from, people in the 20s and 30s, and right after the Second World War even, stayed in the community pretty well, where they were brought up and born. And then there began to be this travel and the movement about. And I think it's happened. Not only Muncie isn't that peculiar in itself. It happened, even happened in Oneida. People moved in and moved out, and the demographics changed considerably because of the mobility of people.
Did you choose St. Mary's because of where you lived, or how did you?
I chose St. Mary's because of where we lived, yes. I came over to St. Mary's, got to know Father Grady well when Father Grady was here as an assistant for 5 years. in those years, the early 60s. I'd have to check the years, but that he was here, but it would have been late 50s, early 60s for a 5-year period.
So you were here before they built Knoll Hall then?
I was here, I attended the liturgies in the basement of Knoll Hall. And as you know, the parish was started in 1930 when Father Sear bought the first part of this land and started the parish in 1930 and built Knoll Hall, built the basement of Knoll Hall. And Margaret and I were married in the basement of Knoll Hall. We have a picture in our, we have 5 pictures all framed in one frame in our bedroom that display the liturgy at which we were married by Father Grady, who gave Margaret her instructions. She was a Methodist and became Catholic before we were married. And Father Grady became very, very close as a friend, as Monsignor Sear was. The first parish council was started at St. Mary's Parish in 1960, just before I was married. And I was elected to the first parish council, and Tom Cannon was the president of the parish council, a lawyer here, and I succeeded him. I became president of the parish council. It would have been in, let's see, would probably been in, I'm searching here, but 1966 to 70 was the first. We had 4-year terms, so I was elected to the first parish council in 66 and probably served as president from 68 or 69 to 70. And had a great relationship with Monsignor Sear, someone I truly appreciated. Father Grady married us, became a very close personal friend, and went from here to Monticello, and then to Peru, and then to Winchester, and then came back here as the pastor, and that would have been in
73 or
74. Yeah,
it
was in 74. It was in 1974 that he became the pastor. And it was Father McDonald came when the Monsignor retired and moved out to his home. That would have been in 1969, yeah, probably. In 1969, when he retired, we received word from the bishop that Father McDonald, who was then the pastor of Mount Carmel in Carmel, would be coming here as the pastor. And at the time, I recall St. Mary's was holding bingo parties in Knoll Hall every week, an activity that brought a lot of money to St. Mary's Parish early on. The money, frankly, that we were deriving from those bingo things diminished. The money went down the hill a little bit. And like my relationship with Father Grady and Father McDonald, I had some areas with Monsignor Sear where I agreed, and some I didn't agree, but we had a great personal relationship, very close. And I told Monsignor Sear I didn't think that was too good a process, because bingo was not a legal function to be carrying on at the time. And we had a member of the parish who was flirting with the sheriff's job, and I thought that in that environment one could picture the opportunity for anyone who wanted to give the Catholic Church a little printer's ink on the front page of the newspaper, that the opportunity would be there to or to raise questions about the bingo while we had a member of the parish in the sheriff's office. So
the authorities must have known about this.
Oh, sure, everybody knew about it, and I thought this is something that's really someone who, and I didn't know of anyone who had that motive, but I knew that it wouldn't be a surprise if someone made an issue out of this. So I wrote to Father McDonald, long letter, and I said, I'd like to come down and see you. I've never met, and I'd like to come down and say hello, Father McDonald, and I want to not surprise you when I get down there. I want to talk to you about this bingo situation, and you're the pastor. So he called me, invited me down, had a wonderful time with him, and we became very, very close friends, Father McDonald and I. In fact, I was his executor when he died. But around our house and around his rectory and through his illness and through the loss of his housekeeper, cancer, and so on, Margaret and I he became a member of our family. We were really very close.
Was it his vision to build this new rectory?
Well, the rectory, and he had I don't know that they called it a finance council, but it was a finance committee, and I served as chairman of that, and we spent a lot of time together, and he wanted to build a rectory. So in 1972 or 3, we began to think about this, and we had the money to do it, and this rectory cost about $500,000. And together we spent a lot of time with the plans and so on. And then when Father McDonald died in the spring of 1974, the rectory was sort of, the contract had not yet been let, but the plans were all here, and we had the approval of Bishop Gallagher. And so Bishop Gallagher went from the death of Father McDonald in the spring until September before he announced the new pastor. And the new pastor would be Father Rady. And a couple of interesting stories on that too. But when we had the funeral for Father Mack, the bishop said, I'm not going to appoint a pastor to come over there and sign a contract. The first thing he does is build a $500,000 rectory. That wouldn't be kind to anyone. So I'm going to leave Father Pat Cole, who was here as an assistant, and I'm going to make him the administrator for a few months. And you stick close to him, and I want you and Father Mack had all this program, and I want you to get the contract signed, get the rectory going, and get committed, and then we'll sign a new pastor. And I was at the time I was going through the chairs for the chairmanship of the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, and I traveled a great deal. And I was, after his funeral here, I left on a long trip to Asia, and Margaret went with the bishop. We flew in our airplane. The bishop and Margaret went to Pennsylvania for Father Mack's entombment and liturgy there. And she was a great salesman during that time with the bishop, saying, you got to send Father Grady to St. Mary's. But she said, I want you to know that because he had married us, given her instructions, and we stayed close to him when he was in Peru, Monticello, Winchester, and so on. And he traveled with us a lot. And she said, but I want you to know, Bishop, that if he ever takes the collar off, I'm going to steal him. And we had a lot of, Bishop Gallagher was an Irish guy, and once you got to know him, he had a great sense of humor and was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful man. And so we had a lot of, the parish was a great part of our life. The priests that were here were great, great parts of our life, and the lives of our children. And
any particular priest other than Father Grady that made an impression on you?
Oh, Father Stone, Father Paul Cochran, Father Tim Alkire, and our pastors all have been close friends. And we have traditionally had close friends. We had a home in Michigan for many years and a home in Arizona, and the priests there were very close to us. Father Grady went to the Vatican with us on a couple of trips. On Margaret's 65th birthday, Father Grady traveled with us, and we went to Israel, and we went to Cana, and we redid our wedding vows at Cana on her 65th birthday. And Father said the Mass, and it was a marvelous experience. And we went down to the River Jordan, and he took his shoes off and rolled his pants legs up, which you know would be odd for Father Grady. And we went out in the river, and he rebaptized us in the River Jordan. But so the parish and the church and the priests who have been in the parish and the bishop have all been very, very close friends.
All your children went to
All of our children went to school here at St. Mary's. The last three went through, we started the seventh and eighth grades, so Paul, our third child, was the first class to go through the 7th and 8th grades, and they all went to school here, yes. 5 children. Father Grady was present and either was the celebrant or concelebrated every one of their weddings. And we have 19 grandchildren, and he baptized the big majority of those. Some of them where the father was from a different. We have a son-in-law who has a priest who's an uncle. So that priest also from Pittsburgh has been very close. Has been to this, stayed here at the rectory often and said Mass here. And so he's part of the family too, and he baptized that family's children.
You talked about Ontario then. You became involved with Ontario? You said it was a silver?
Yes, I practiced law here for about a year and a half, and then my stepfather came out here he had been president of the Wallace Silver Company, flatware, Wallace Sterling, and he retired. And he really wanted to buy the Wallace Silver Company from that family. He had been the CEO. So I was his lawyer, and we made some offers, and we were never able, it was a big family, we were never able to get all the family members together. So he had retired, and the Ontario Silver Company, which had been in Muncie, just a few blocks from the parish, and a factory in the center of the city, a factory that when it was built in the 1890s was on the outskirts of town, all of a sudden was in town as the town grew. And that had been sold. It was owned by people in Muncie for quite a while, people that moved here from Ontario, Canada, and made flatware, made silverware. My stepfather knew that company, and the people who had purchased Ontario Company in the Second World War were a Jewish merchandising outfit from New York, and good merchandisers, not very good manufacturers. So they offered my stepfather, who they knew, the opportunity to come out to Muncie and run that plant for them because they couldn't find a good manager to make a plant. And he came out here in 1953 part-time, and that's how we happened to get associated with Muncie. He had known the company years ago and so on. So he was managing that half-time. And after I had practiced law for about a year, we put together an offer, and we bought the Muncie manufacturing facility from the merchandising outfit in New York. We called it an Ontario Corporation, and we owned it. And so we had some fun with that. We had been manufacturing flatware, knives, forks, and spoons, and we went from that to manufacturing the blades for jet engines, because the blade, the airfoil, is made of the same material, the same process as a knife blade. So we got that was early in the jet engine days, and we got into making those airfoils, and That was what Ontario did.
That factory, was that the original one on Jackson? Or?
Yes, right on Jackson, just 5 blocks or 6 blocks from the parish. Maybe 7 or 8. There's small blocks here.
It's where the medical center is, not in.
Yes, we tore that plant. We sold the forging business, the business that made the airfoils, and we tore that plant down that had been built in 1890, cleared the 11 acres, and now we have the pathologists have a big laboratory, and we just announced that Whitinger, the accounting firm, will build a building there also. And we have one major other plot available that we're for sale, and it's fun. Some interesting things about St. Mary's. I recall that one day I was having dinner with the family, and the telephone rang, and this voice said, "Smith?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "This is," and I think his name was Zombrowski. If it wasn't Zombrowski, it was very close to that. And he said, "We've met before," and he said, "I'm a wrecker, and I'm over here in Anderson, Indiana, and I'm tearing down the hospital. And up on top of the hospital, I've got this great big Hail Mary." And I said, "Hail Mary?" And he said, "Yeah, it's a big stone statue." And he said, "I just wonder, you want that? What'll I do with it?" And so I called Father Grady, and now that's the little statue of our Blessed Mother that's on the end of the rectory, is that Hail Mary from the top of the torn down hospital in Anderson, Indiana. That there just been a great many things that part of our lives that have been here around the parish. And in the church generally, we've had the opportunity and the great advantage of one time being on I served 22 years on the Commission for Higher Education in Indiana, and I was on a panel with Father Bill Byron, who is a very well-known Jesuit, and we got to know each other. And Father Byron became president of Catholic University of America. And he called me. And at that time, Catholic University of America had a board of trustees with all hierarchy, all the cardinals, some archbishops, and some bishops, and one nun. And they had a board of regents of lay people. So he asked me if I'd join the board of regents, and I did, and we enjoyed a couple of years there. And then the Board of Trustees said, we're going to have to change the Board of Trustees at Catholic University to have some lay people on. A minority, but some lay people on. So I went on, I was happy and honored to go on the board of Catholic University Board of Trustees. And then they came to the conclusion that if we're going to have a Board of Trustees and some lay people, the vice chairman ought to be a lay person. So we went through, just as they do with every Board of Trustees vacancy, or just as they do with all of their hierarchy elections, we went through a secret vote. We met at the boardroom of the American Catholic Conference in Washington. That's where we always met as trustees. They went through the secret vote, and I was elected vice chairman of the Board of Trustees of Catholic University of America, and served with all of the cardinals. Got to know Cardinal Mahoney from Los Angeles didn't come all the time, but great guys. Cardinal Connor, Cardinal Law, Cardinal Kroll back then, later to be Bevilacqua, all of the cardinals. And always the Archbishop of Washington was the chancellor, so we got to know the cardinals from Washington very well. And then when Cardinal Law resigned from his archbishop's job in Boston, he also resigned as chairman of the trustees at Catholic University of America. And when he did that, we had an old set of bylaws that some lawyer just pulled out of the book. And I became the chairman of the board, which was always a big spot for the hierarchy. I became the chairman of the board, and it was about 9 months before we got that all worked out and got everything changed. So I was interim chairman for a while, and I was really pleased. they invited Margaret and me, the Board of Trustees and the President of the Catholic U invited us to California about a week ago, about 2 weeks ago. They have a retreat every other year, and they invited us out, and I got an honorary doctorate from Catholic University a couple of weeks ago, so it was really a nice honor, and we've made some wonderful Catholic friends in the hierarchy.
You're involved in the John the 22nd.
Yeah, we're also, we got to know Cardinal Maida very well, and that was interesting. Cardinal Maida used to be the Bishop of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he's both a canon lawyer and a civil lawyer. And he was the lawyer for the American Catholic Conference. They hired lawyers, but he chaired their legal committee. And when Mrs. Aquino ran against Marcos at the Philippines, President Reagan appointed a group to go to the Philippines to observe the election on behalf of the American president. And we had come to know the Reagans and the older Bushes pretty well while I was chairman of the U.S. Chamber. So he appointed me to go, and I went with Bishop Maida. And Bishop Maida said Mass every day, and I was the only other Catholic on that little group that observed the election, so I was his altar boy. We got well acquainted. Then he spoke Polish very well, and when John Paul was the Pope, why, Cardinal Maida became first the Archbishop of Detroit, and then the Cardinal Archbishop of Detroit, and then the president of the John Paul II Foundation. So we followed him along, and we were on the board of the JP2 Foundation and built the John Paul II Center and raised money and built that center in Washington. So we had the real privilege. Catholic University is the only university in America that is chartered by the Vatican, chartered by the Pope. So every other year we met with the Holy Father. And I was on the executive committee, so we'd go over and meet with the Holy Father every other year. And then the John Paul II Foundation every other year. So once a year, Margaret and I got to go over and took Father Grady a couple times. He's had his picture in the paper and so on. But we several times had audiences with John Paul II. Interesting man. We've been interested in politics a lot, and you go to these political things and see people of great stature and notoriety stand in line meeting people, and so often you get, when you go through a line shaking hands, they're looking behind and they're looking ahead to see who was there, and they give you a quick nod and so on. Not the Holy Father. I never met any person in my life who was so intent on the person to whom he was talking. He just made you feel like you were there, and this was what his day was all about. He had that great personal warmth and attraction that is. I get tearful when I think about it.
His English was pretty good.
His English, yes, was good.
Very strong accent.
Very strong accent. Yes, you could. He could speak English well. Not like current Pope speaks very good English and has a great sense of humor. But he does speak. He did speak good English. His ability to communicate as he became afflicted with Parkinson's he really couldn't express himself very well, and you could tell it was a frustration. And it depended. We noticed the differences, but the people around him said it depends on where you got him in his medicinal cycle. If he had just taken medicine, he had a few hours where he was better than if it was just before his medical cycle. So, well, that's more than you want to know, probably.
What about the future of the parish?
The future of this parish. Well, this parish has grown from 100 families when it started to got up to 1,000 families, is now back down to about 820 families or so, and is I think has a good future. It is an interesting parish in the sense that we've never had a mortgage. We built this church for $1,200,000, and it was built for cash. And it was cornerstone was laid in '63, and it was '65 when really it was built. And then about a year later, it was consecrated, meaning it had no debt, and always happening on the 15th of August, Holy Day. And the church was sort of interesting. There were with not at the time the church was built, but eventually. Now we have 27 acres, but there was still a patch that belonged to the family, the Kitzelman family, which Father Grady and I sat around our kitchen table talking about whether or not we ought to pay I forget, $60,000 or something for that piece of land, which we did. But we always had the money. Monsignor Sear was a great money raiser. I can recall things that you couldn't do today, John Wakeland. He had a campaign, and under glass in the back, in the old Knoll Hall, where you went upstairs from the liturgy center, he had a bulletin board with glass in front of it, and it was locked, closed and locked. And behind that glass, he would put the names of parishioners and the amount of money that they pledged, and he would open it every month and bring up to date how much they had paid on their pledge. And you'd never get away with that today. But that's the way he raised money. And then Father Mack came, and as head of his little finance committee, or I don't think they called it, we didn't call it finance council in those days, but the first 3 years I made the pitch to the parish, and we had people sign up as to what amount they would give for the year. It was the predecessor of what lately was called God's Plan or something. But Father Mack raised a lot of money. Father Mack raised more money on Sundays than we're raising here today. And we built this rectory, $500,000, and we never did any financing. Then Father Grady came along, and Father Grady really hated, despised asking people for money. But he did arrange a crowd that would go out and do it. So we had that same program. Finally, we got it installed, that where people would sign up to say how much they were going to give for the year, and it worked pretty well. And Father Grady raised money, and we had a buffer here. We had a nice several $100,000 of savings and so on. And then he wanted to build a Sears Center. And he and I went around to different parishes. I remember spending lots of time with a tape measure and so on at Kokomo when we built the gymnasium over here. And we had a lot of fun with that project. And he wanted to build that project, and it was going to cost, he said $500,000 when we started. It finally cost about $700,000. But we built the new classrooms and the principal's office and the cafeteria and the gymnasium for about $700,000. And we had about half of it before we ever started. And we had one $300,000 anonymous gift, and that people could match. And I remember chairing that campaign, and we got that other 300 pretty quickly, and built that. Again, no financing. We have borrowed money from time to time to do some things, but never had to get a mortgage the way most parishes do or have done.
Once it's consecrated, can you have a mortgage again then?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, the bishop owns the property. An interesting thing, the bishop used to own the properties for all the parishes and owned all of the assets in his name. And I remember the diocese owned a whole set of acreage out on Wheeling Avenue, just north of Tillotson, where there is a big open field and a Protestant church in the back of that field now on the west side of Wheeling. And we owned that. And I was practicing law when the bishop decided to sell that, because we weren't going to build another parish there. So since everything was in the bishop's name, I remember the lawyer on the other side insisted that we say that the bishop and any issue, now known or unknown in the future, was conveying that title. I remember that. But since then, the diocese has set up a corporation, and the bishop really runs the corporation, but the corporation owns all that. So that corporation could give title, and you could use that as collateral. While in canon law, you probably, there's some question about it, but you could use it as an asset. But that, great days. You ask about the future. It seems to me that Muncie has undergone a great transition. Muncie was a Midwestern automotive town where many people would, for some generations, graduate from high school or leave high school, go to work in an automotive plant, make a suitable living, and retire and have a nice retirement, compared to a lot of places around the world, even compared to a lot of places around this country. And that sort of stable pattern has been interrupted. And the Muncie community has lost those manufacturing jobs, obviously because they priced themselves out of the world market. Today, you can buy a Toyota with more American input than the Chevrolet, because people who ran those companies are forced to go overseas to be competitive, to sell a product. So it has changed the Muncie community. Muncie's largest employers are obviously the hospital and the university. And then there are a group of emerging, smaller, some locally owned companies, some companies owned other places. And I think that the nature of the populace is changing. The automotive companies took an awful lot of Muncie Central High School graduates, but they had a predominant, not predominant maybe, but certainly 50% of the automotive jobs were filled by people who came here generally from Tennessee or Kentucky. And that is not happening today. And many of those who had those jobs have gone to other automotive communities or back to their home communities. And the nature of this community is changing. And the jobs that are here, I think here in the neighborhood, the old Ontario plant has gone where there were forge people. Ontario Systems comes along across the street with more employees, 450 employees, the majority of whom have college degrees.
You're involved in the Ontario Systems.
Well, we sold Ontario Systems recently to a fund. But I go to work every day at Cherry Labs. We have 182 people. 70% of them have a college graduate. We have 2 or 3 doctorates. We have lots of master's degrees.
And that's in that same area?
It's in Daleville.
Oh, it's in Daleville.
Yeah. So it was on Madison Street. We moved it to Daleville because we needed more room and better space, and tore that plant down, and that's now the new Taco Bell on Madison Street. But that's happening here. And so the people who work at the university, the people who work at the hospital, the people that work at the Ontario Systems or the Cherry Labs or the other companies that are emerging have a different profile as a population. And I think that's a major change taking place, and that has an effect on St. Mary's Parish. So that's one general trend. And that
higher educational level.
Yes, yes, and more mobility. Here today, gone tomorrow. The other thing that has happened, I think, in the Catholic Church in America is that you remember himself. He was the pastor. The church in Oneida, the church was on Main Street, and it was the biggest building in Oneida, and Oneida was mainly Catholic, and the pastor was himself. And he probably had a lawyer or two and a physician in the parish, maybe two physicians. And everybody, and he was the educated guy with their exception, and they were very busy and didn't get involved. Today, the pastor at this parish probably has less academic training than many, many, many of his parishioners. And it just isn't himself anymore.
And you have the ELM program this spring.
Yes, yes. And the transparency that has to take place in the church, that has taken place, because of all that, was just exaggerated with the horrendously bad, and I take blame as a Catholic, the tremendously horrible way that the whole problem of priests' activities were handled. And all of that demands transparency. The thing that today that we see in the church is we're very familiar with the diocese in Phoenix. On the front page of the paper was all a discussion of the ordinary who had problems of depression and finally had to resign. And we had two priests who have now been criminally indicted for stealing money in their parishes. And all of this just demands a transparency today that didn't exist in the church. And we see it fighting in this parish. There just is a need for the church in today's world to catch up with what is not a criticism of parishioners of the priest, but it is a need in today's world just to be transparent.
Do you see that coming? Do you see that?
Oh, absolutely, it's coming. Well, all of the Vatican II and the idea of having finance councils and parish councils, and I was with a group of ordinaries, group of priests, 2 archbishops and 3 bishops, sitting having a glass of wine at Mondavi's operation out in the Napa Valley a couple of weeks ago when I was out there. And I was the only lay person there, and good friends. And we were all talking, and one of those bishops said that in his bishop, he is now requiring any parish that handles $1 million to have an outside audit. And it is a new coming challenge, and we just have to be ahead of those. But that type of thing, I think, is in the change in the population that Muncie is experiencing, the change in the background of Catholics in the parishes, the profile of priests who, I think all of these people who are parishioners, who have a great deal more experience usually than the young priest, they're not motivated because they want to run things. They're brought to the parish by a need for spiritual help and for a spiritual community. And the priest has the opportunity that the lay people do not have to perform the sacramental needs and to the liturgical needs of that community. And the community itself has a lot more experience in this parish or any parishes today in the American Catholic Church to help and to do those other things, the running of the school. How can you take a young guy out of the seminary and make him have him run a school, and then he just can't be the himself that we used to know in the 20s.
The lack of priests now. You have
Yes.
one priest instead of pastor and several.
Absolutely.
With a great strain on that.
Yeah. Yeah, we're so fortunate here because we have Father Keene. And I have not made a count, but I would bet Father Keene says more masses than our pastor. And what a blessing we have. Saturday morning had a cup of coffee with Father Keene at the time. What a blessing this parish has that he's here. He just is retired and he's perked up, I think, a little bit. But it's a wonderful parish. It's a wonderful community in transition. How blessed we are. I sit around our kitchen table and try to say to our kids and grandkids, you should regularly do two things. We should regularly concentrate on the day you were born. There were people born all over this world. And you were born here. You were born in this family, in this parish, in this community, and how fortunate you were. You really, with God's help, won the lottery. And then secondly, to say we have learned from our many friends with priests. We have never learned enough, but we've learned that you ought to do your audit, and your audit ought to be, how is your life in relationship to your Creator? How is your life in relationship to your family? How is your life in relationship to your vocation? And how is your life in relationship to your friends and community? In that order. And that you ought to take that audit regularly, and you ought to help each other. You know, Margaret helps me with that audit, and I don't have to help her. She helps me. But those are things that are the basis for the parish, and that it is those things that draw us together. And so the parish has many different people. Some people like horseback. Some people have never been on a farm. There are so many people of different interests, but they're brought together in a parish by their spiritual desire. And that is where the priest, with fewer priests and with people able to do other things, that's where we need to have the priest concentrate.
We're fortunate to have a deacon here also.
Oh, absolutely. What a wonderful blessing that is, and particularly, the deacons by the dozen, but we got a real gem. We have a real gem here, and that really helps.
Anything else that you'd like to talk about? Anything that you...
No, anything that you particularly think about?
I think we covered just about...
We were blessed. One thing about this parish, a real big happening in this parish that we didn't talk about is the fact that Bishop Gallagher was here. When Bishop Gallagher came here, I had been I had been to every Republican convention. I think national conventions. I always ran for delegate in Indiana, and fortunately got elected every time. But Bishop Gallagher, when he was chairman of Catholic Charities, and spoke at both the Republican and the Democrat National Committee at their conventions on behalf of the Catholic Church. He testified. He was the American Conference loved to pass him around because he was so articulate. And when he came here, I was really happy when he came here. I didn't know him personally, but I knew of him. And when he came here, he called around to the parishes, and he had every parish send 2 people. And he created what he called the Committee of 100. And Father Grady picked 2 people, and then 2 of us went to that meeting. And the first meeting was held out on the lawn at the bishop's residence in Lafayette, up on the hill. Beautiful day. And the bishop sat up in front, and he had 3 people, all of whom I knew. A banker, a construction guy, and a retired guy from Lafayette. And they were at the picnic table where he sat up in front. They were at the table with him. And he introduced them as, this is going to be the president of the Committee of 100, and here's the vice president, here's the treasurer. And somebody from Anderson got up and said, Your Excellency, does this mean that everything that's done around here is just going to be done by the bishop, and that you're calling us here just to rubber stamp something, or how did these people get elected? And the bishop thought for a minute, and he said, well, you know, I was going to say the first thing we'll do is have lunch because the lunch is ready. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to suggest that we get one person from each deanery. Now, you get together in each deanery and you elect one person. That's going to be the nominating committee. And he said, I made an error. I just picked these because I thought it would be a way to get going. We should do it and get a nominating committee from each of the, well, they did. They got one person from each deanery during lunch. And by golly, I got nominated as the first president of the committee of 100 for the diocese. So I sat upside of Bishop. We got well acquainted, very well acquainted over the years, and we were so.
That was a wise thing he did.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
You know, and we were so fortunate. A lot of people said he, would take issue with some of the things he did, but that's true with any ordinary.
He taught at the school. He loved to teach at the school when he was retired.
And, well, when he became ill and retired, he came here with the thought that, and the physicians had said, you probably have a year to live. And he said, I want to go over, and I remember him saying, if I have a year to live, the Lord could bless me by allowing me to live that year with Bill Grady, Father Bill Grady. So he came over here and lived 7.5 years, 8 years, and we had a bishop here for 8 years. But I sat around that kitchen table in the rectory having coffee with Bishop Grady on many occasions. He had that little apartment downstairs, or Bishop Gallagher, many occasions. And what a super guy.
He was a social worker.
Yes, yep, from Cleveland. There are a bunch of them from Cleveland up there. And we had the privilege, now they don't anymore, but for 40 years I had a partnership where we had an airplane, and we traveled a lot. We took him to Cleveland Clinic during his illness. He loved Cleveland, and that's where he was treated.
So he was diagnosed even when he retired?
Yes, that's why he retired.
Cancer?
Cancer, yes. And he lived a lot longer than people thought he would. But a good guy. And
it's unfortunate there's only one priest in Gallagher Manor, isn't it?
Yes, it is. That Gallagher Manor was another one. That was Father Grady's great hope that we could do that, and we shared that. We once at dinner, I was telling Cardinal Law and Bishop Banks, I know, who used to be an ordinary for him, and then went to Green Bay, about how in this parish we had a group of people who really wanted to see some place that would allow the priest to come and retire. In our diocese, we had none. And so we had this home over here when we got rid of, when we no longer had sisters to run the school. It was vacant. So we, Father Grady thought, gee, this would be great. And we raised about $1,200,000. But we set up a committee, or a corporation, set up a separate corporation. And we took title to that piece of land where the house is, just that piece of land there, from the diocese to the manor, to the new corporation. And it is not a diocesan corporation. I hear many people here at this parish say, well, now is the diocese going to take care of that? Diocese, it's not a diocesan corporation. And in telling, I remember explaining that one night to Cardinal Law, Bishop Banks, he said, oh, young bishop. Because he doesn't own that. It's owned by this, and there's a board. There are 5 of us on the board over there.
That includes where the garages are?
Yes, we built the garages. It was a $100,000 gift.
No, just the area.
Yeah, just the area where the buildings are. Mm-hmm. And I think the front down to the street. That's it. I'm not sure, but
is there a fund that keeps for the maintenance and so on? Or?
Yeah, Father Grady left his Father McDonald left his estate to the parish. Father Grady left his estate to the manor. And it's it has some money, and if we had when we have 3 priests there, we'll be able to manage that very well. And it's moving along well now. It's got money and so on. There is a facility there to have a housekeeper, and there has been discussion because we have 5 priests at table here at St. Mary's. But there are many times when there's just 1 or 2 at dinner because they all have some idiosyncratic lifestyles. But there has been discussion about the fact that if we get a couple more priests over there, or when we get a couple more priests over there, that maybe the table would be over there. That it would be silly to have 2 tables here on the parish grounds for priests. And
you wonder why there aren't more priests that would be willing to retire there, or do they go back to their own home? Or?
Well, really, we haven't had a lot of retirements here in this period, and those that have retired had been planning long enough so they had some things going, and I think there are some. We have a reception over there, once a year for priests, and there are a group of priests who eventually would like to get there. It's kind of waiting it out for them, there are 2 or 3 who said, I would like to do this, but I don't know. It's encouraging to see we do have some seminarians now. So I think the feeder system in many parishes. I look at the Archbishop Myers, who is now the Archbishop of Newark, has 260 people in the seminary. You look at some of these things that are coming now, and I'm so encouraged, John, by the commitment and the personalities of the young priests. You can't speak universally for everyone, but as a group, young seminarians today are, I think, more solid. There's some feeling about them being more solid than maybe the periods we've gone through and recently in the church. I'm
probably a number of them before went in too young when they had the minor seminaries and they could leave out of the 8th grade.
Well, I'm very encouraged by the seminarians, and this the young Collins, Jim Collins from our parish here, who was we were at his ordination and ordained by the Cardinal in Chicago. What an absolute marvelous young priest. Jesuit. And when he came here, the leader of his community was here. Another fine man, middle-aged man, and Victor and I were talking with him and thanked him for coming down for Jim's first Mass in our parish. And he said, well, the reason I'm down here, he said, this guy's going to be making my assignment someday, so I'm going to... But I think everybody recognizes that we've got a great priest that came out of this parish, really.
And his mother went to the same high school as my wife.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
In Cincinnati?
Mm-hmm. Seton High School.
Sure. I know Seton High School in Cincinnati. I was on the board at Synergy, which and spent a lot of time in Cincinnati. And the Archbishop down there was a great friend of Bishop Gallagher. And while Bishop Gallagher was active in the conference, the Archbishop, that's now in Cincinnati, was the president of the Council of Miracle Conference of Catholic Bishops. Good guy.
Well, is there anything else Have we pretty much covered?
Oh, I have, if you think we have.
Well, we could go on. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
We could go on, but I think I'll probably let you go.
Yeah, we've used our hour.
Well, that's